Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, as panic over coronavirus spreads around the world, there seems to be another front opening up again in the Middle East between the U.S. and Iran, specifically in Iraq at this point in time. But in that regard, we've had the U.S. House of Representatives as well as the Senate pass a war powers resolution which limits Donald Trump's power to be able to go to war with Iran. This all stems from the U.S. decision to assassinate Qasem Soleimani as well as others on Iraqi soil not too long ago, a few months ago. And we know that the tensions that brought up to the fore with the Iranian retaliation on U.S. troops in Iraq as well. Iraq, again, very much the theater of this back and forth between the U.S. and Iran. We've now had this attack on Camp Taji as well, this rocket attack, and then retaliation by the U.S. on what it's calling Iran-backed militias. Even an airport in the city of Karbala in Iraq has been hit as well by the U.S. So things seem to be heating up again, and not a lot of the world's eyes seem to be on that at this point in time. Let's discuss that further and the implications, of course, of these tensions once again ratcheting it up. We're joined now by Barbara Benitez, who is assistant professor at George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Joining us also from D.C. is Reza Khanzadeh, who is a research fellow at Sharif University think tank and a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. And joining us from Miami is Glenn Alexander Crowther, who is a visiting research professor at Florida International University. Glenn, Reza, and Barbara, thank you to all three of you for your time this morning. Reza, let me start with you. How important was this resolution to be passed? Certainly, Donald Trump will veto it when it comes to his table, but nevertheless, it seems bipartisan agreement, seemingly, on wanting Trump to be limited and controlled in some way when it comes to Iran.
Right, and bipartisan, that term used very loosely, I believe, because you had 6 Democrats vote against, but then also 6 Republicans vote for. So, but it is very important. You are correct, because I believe with the way Trump's foreign policy has been moving forward in the past almost 4 years now, you see this type of rhetoric that does kind of point or hint towards war and escalation, but then almost immediately, or maybe a few days, a few weeks after, he kind of pulls back. But that kind of erratic approach to foreign policy, especially when there's multiple actors, that is it's too scary of a I guess scenario, so to speak, to allow him to have that kind of free reign, if you will. So passing this resolution, I do believe, was a major step forward in a very positive direction, and not just for him and his presidency, but also future presidents to come.
Glenn, what are your thoughts about this? Because for Donald Trump, or any president really in the U.S. or around the world, really, a commander-in-chief needs to have that right to be able to defend his or her homeland or interests, right? But at the same time, if we look at the timeline of how these tensions, or the most recent tensions with Iran, ratcheted up, it all begun with the U.S. essentially first walking away from the nuclear deal, and then it making the decision to assassinate Qasem Soleimani on Iraqi soil. Do you think that Trump may have just stepped too far, and even the U.S. establishment may, to an extent, realize that he needs to be reined in?
Well, I see this mainly as an attempt by Congress to claw back their power that was provided to them in the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, they're the ones who have to provide for making war. And so Johnson in Vietnam got us in deep. And so in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, and it essentially says that the president can take steps to defend the country, but has to report to Congress within 48 hours. And they only have 60 days to complete the mission if they don't get approval from Congress. So this is well within our legal existing framework within the United States. Congress has been almost supine in allowing presidents to use force abroad without their approval.
You know, Barbara, when it came to justification for the Soleimani assassination, I'll go back to that because that's where, you know, these most recent tensions ratcheted up from. You know, the Trump administration wasn't seemingly able to give enough of a satisfactory explanation for why he felt he was justified in doing that. What do you make of that?
Well, that's right, and they've gone back and forth, and they haven't come with a clear reasoning, even though they're claiming imminent threat, as we all know. They haven't been able to prove an imminent threat, and it was just last week, I believe, on the end of February, that the House had called Mike Pompeo before it to discuss this, and even he had a belligerent attitude. He skirted around. So this was pretty much one of the reasons that they pressed ahead with this vote. It was bipartisan, although it wasn't an overwhelming majority. There were still some that voted against it. And as you mentioned, this is going to go before the White House. He's expected to veto, and it's unlikely that it would even become law. So we've seen tensions continue, even with yesterday, and it remains to be seen if this is going to even hold any teeth.
Indeed. So then, Reza, should we all be worried? Because, when Soleimani was assassinated, a lot of the world was saying, okay, we're now really at the brink of war. There's going to be World War III, right? That's what a lot of people were saying. And others were saying, no, that's not going to happen. However, that was the initial fear on many people's part. Do you think that we're pushing sort of that red line once again at this time?
Unfortunately, I do. But then again, I was in Iran when Soleimani was assassinated. I was in Tehran, and being a research fellow at one of the major universities in Tehran, if not the country, and kind of having that access or that comings and goings with students and professors and members of the public policy world in Iran, that fear didn't really exist compared to the kind of conversations I was hearing or watching back in America or in Europe. So it's kind of tough to say, but given the 40 plus years now of the type of tense relationship U.S. and Iran has had, or particularly Washington and Tehran have had, there is still a cause for concern and for fear that this may lead to war. And once again, going back to our previous conversation, given the fact that Trump has had this type of foreign policy where they call it maximum pressure, but you still don't know from one day to the next what kind of approach he will take with his foreign policy. Looking at North Korea, for example, but even with Iran. So yeah, there is some fear. But again, in Iran, I didn't see it that much back in January.
Okay, so then, Glenn, let's for a moment, if you can, what your thoughts are about this maximum pressure campaign, right, as the Trump administration has termed it, on Iran. Do you think it succeeded?
I think that Trump believes he's gaining his objectives through this maximum pressure campaign. That's why I don't feel that there's going to be a war. And honestly, the targeted killing of Soleimani was part of that. If you look at the State Department website, it connects him with the deaths of over 600 American soldiers during the intervention in Iraq. So I don't think we're going to have any problems. We're going to have maximum pressure and some amount of violence around the edges, maybe Iranian boats bothering American ships, things like that. I think you'll see a lot of nibbling around the edges, but I don't see a war. I see Trump as believing he's gaining his objectives.
But then I wonder, Barbara, there's only so much that you can poke and poke and poke before somebody reacts, right?
And this is true. We've seen this playing out with the soldiers in Iraq who have been subjected to barrages of attacks. I see this continuing more of a tit for tat than an all-out war. The closest I would say that it got, it was the fear back last summer when the drone attack, when the drone was shot down by the Iranians. There was a fear that there would be this harsh retaliation. At the time, Bolton was pressing for that, but Trump held back. So it was kind of surprising when he all out went after Soleimani. That was probably one of the moments where there was that question of, wow, could this truly lead to a war? But I think moving forward, we're just going to see a lot of pretty much tit for tat, if you want to call it that, of what we've been seeing, an attack on U.S. soldiers based in Iraq, a retaliatory strike. Will it lead to a bigger conflict? I don't believe it will, because this administration is well aware that that would not be an easy feat, as much as it may sound to, especially in Trump's mind. There are a lot of players within the Middle East that press back and pretty much help contain it during this last issue with the killing of General Soleimani.
Very well, Reza, I'll give you the final word. Just tell us, Reza, at this point, maximum pressure campaign, the goal of it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was to bring Iran almost back to the negotiating table to be able to renegotiate, in some ways, a new deal, right, which would include then ballistic missiles as well as Iran's role in the region, etc. Have you gotten a feeling that in Iran, anyone at this point in time is willing to actually sit at a table with the U.S.?
No, absolutely not, which for me is alarming, because I was from a distance involved in the very early stages of those negotiations for the JCPOA, and going back and forth to and from Iran, and now seeing that even those that did support Rouhani and Zarif in those negotiations, those that did support this type of de-thawing of tension between Washington and Tehran, now joining the far right, if you will, in Tehran, or the conservatives, and coming out publicly almost and stating that we do not want to renegotiate or go back to the table, if you will, and have another discussion for what some people are saying a JCPOA 2.0. But yeah, it's there does not seem to be any positive light there in Iran as far as speaking to Washington again.
Okay.
But then again, on the other side, there could be a possibility depending on what happens after November.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there at that, but of course we appreciate all of our guests speaking to us there, Barbara, Reza, and Glenn, for their time this morning and for giving us their insight on this worrying topic, really, isn't it? Because as I put to our guests, we always seem to go to the brink when it comes to U.S. and Iran relations and whether or not there's going to be an escalation in that regard. I mean, the Soleimani assassination was probably as close to the red line as one could get for Iran's side, and Iran did retaliate. However, it was a fairly measured, arguably even muted retaliation in some regards, but it seems that both sides are not willing to let this entire issue go, right? As I put to Glenn as well, this all started with the U.S. essentially walking away from the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which was hard fought, mind you, by both sides, arguably as well, and at the same time, now Donald Trump expecting in some way that through this maximum pressure campaign, Iran will be willing to now negotiate with the U.S. when the U.S. has, in the Iranians' eyes at least, proven that it cannot be trusted. Because if one president negotiates something, who's to say that the next president will even respect such an agreement or deal? That, of course, does not point towards stability in the region at all, especially between these two countries. And that, to all of this playing out on Iraqi soil, with the Iraqis repeatedly saying, we don't want to be a part of this. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.